Hello everybody, welcome to this week's episode of The County Seat. I'm your host Chad Booth. We are bringing you our show today from Richfield, Utah, and we are at the engineering firm of Jones and Demille talking to people about county planning and community planning and how broad the scope of it is and how important it is in all of our lives and how planning gone awry can really create problems. Let's get some background on community planning and how it all developed and what its origins are. We start by talking to Derek Dowsett.
You can't build a home without a plan, so why would a community be any different? There needs to be infrastructure for power, water, natural gas, sewer, and roads. Yet there are different ways that a community comes to fruition and several pieces that need to be nailed down before anything can be built. In Utah, there are some basics that we likely take for granted. There is the physical layout of the streets and properties in an orderly grid. Many Utah cities were established deliberately with a community center and farming around the perimeter. There are the wide established streets with the original intent of allowing a team of oxen and their cart to be able to turn around without unhitching the team. These were all ideas that came out of the Plat for the city of Zion, which was the plan used to establish 250 cities here in Utah by the early Mormon pioneers. The world has changed a lot since that time, and so has community planning. Let's say we are planning a new community from the ground up today. Well, here are 5 ideals we would try to meet as we begin that planning. First, there needs to be a comprehensive vision. This would be used to answer questions like, where will the people live? What kinds of businesses and services are available? How will the community grow over time? This leads to the next step. What are the reasonable expectations or assumptions that would drive local growth? It's unlikely that all the residents, or the businesses for that matter, are going to appear as soon as the community is built. The old cliche says if you build it, they will come, but it doesn't indicate when. That needs to be planned on ahead of time. Quality of life is our third point. Where are the homes in relation to where people work? What services are available and where? How do people get around? What is there to do when people have free time? Fourth, how safe is that community? Are the homes built in an area that is prone to flooding? What is the access to police and fire protection? What about emergency medical services and medical services in general? And lastly, is the community fiscally responsible and sustainable? This ties into things like local taxes to fund government and services in the community. Is the economy diverse enough that it can survive during a recession? How will the community attract and maintain a workforce? Can that workforce afford to live in that community? Is the community built up around a particular natural resource or industry? And how far will that market trend into the future? Or what other plans are there for the economy as it matures? This is a segment of growing concern for a number of communities in our state currently, where the reason for the community has changed, and so the community must adapt to survive. We will talk more about the foundation and evolution of our communities here in Utah in our roundtable discussion. For the County Seat, I'm Derek Dowsett.
We will be right back with the County Seat. We now have a good report. Give us a basis for a conversation. We'll join our panel of experts when we return on the County Seat. Welcome back to the County Seat. We are in Richfield today. We are talking about community planning. Joining us for the conversation is President of Jones and Demille Engineering, Brian Barton. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We have Mike Hansen with a subsidiary of Jones and Demille who does rural community planning as a specialty. And we have Malcolm Nash joining us, who is the Economic Development Director for Sevier County. Thank you all for joining us. Derek's conversation started with, you got to have a plan, okay? And do plans just happen? No, they don't. So on that basis, plans get developed. When is it typically the point where you guys get into the picture? Any of you?
I know in my experience, it's usually when it's too late. You'll get a community that will say, hey, we just discovered we have a problem in our regulations, and can you come help us fix it? And that's usually not a good place you want to be in. Sometimes an application will come in that shines a bright light on a dark corner of code that hasn't been updated for years.
So you're saying something interesting, because there is going to be a default in the people that are watching this show saying community plans are about geography. They are about a master plan for the city and how the buildings are. And you're talking about regulations on how you do things. Does that become part of the plan?
Oh, absolutely. You know, we just in the last few years, we've had some people coming in wanting to do some projects in Sevier County. And as the application has come in and we've reviewed it, we've gone to our zoning ordinance and said, this is going to be a problem because our ordinance doesn't properly address this particular type of project or development. And so for us, that's when it's triggered the need for updating our plan or reviewing it or revising it. And we've just had enough of those in this last few years. We finally just said, all right, we need to fix this. We can't put this off any longer. We need to go.
Is it harder to go back and fix a situation? I mean, how far down the road do you get before a community starts to realize that they've got a problem? I mean, do they say, oh, this is going to become a problem, or is, oh my gosh, we've got to go back and fix 10 years of problems? How does that typically fall out?
One thing that we've seen as a firm is we've done a lot of work in rural areas, Utah, surrounding states, for 38 years now. And what we've found is we've worked with these rural communities, a lot of them have basically taken a cookie cutter approach where maybe somebody had access to a Provo city general plan. They grabbed that 20, 30 years ago and they tried to use it for their own community's general plan. And that just snowballs and creates many problems where it's those planning concepts and strategies were applicable to Provo City 30 years ago, but they're not applicable in rural Utah today.
So, and that raises a very good point, because I mean, the general perception is that you go into a housing development and you walk into the model home and they say, okay, is it going to be the Kingsford, or you're going to take the Chesterfield floor plan? And cities would say, oh, well, they're about the same size, that would work. What kind of things make a difference in that? Is it, I mean, how could Provo's plan be wrong for another place that has a mountain on one side and a big flat spot next to a lake? You'd think it would work, wouldn't it?
You would think, and that's one of the things that we see a lot, and we don't like seeing it. We see communities that will get a vision, sometimes somebody else's vision, and they'll implement it as their own, as their plan. But then every plan needs to be implemented, and so it needs a fiscal component through the budget and so forth, and it needs regulation to implement that vision. And it's kind of funny to think of a mayor that would copy and paste another town's budget. That's the analogy I use when I see them copy and paste the land use regulations, for example, and the ordinances. They have different circumstances, and so it wouldn't make sense to say that they have the same solution.
And what kind of areas do you guys help with? I mean, the bigger picture of the rural specialty, Jones and Demille, how do you help counties get on track?
You know, Jones and Demille, we're very infrastructure focused. We're an engineering firm. And, as we've met with hundreds of communities in these rural areas, it's become clear that the infrastructure element is just a piece of the puzzle. It takes, the planning, the strategy that happens before the infrastructure happens, the policy, the ordinances, the community planning that is so important in development of a community. And that's why we saw that need as a firm, and rural community consultants and Mike Hansen and his expertise has been so invaluable to us and to all of our clients and all of rural Utah and beyond. So Mike has done a great job of taking those needs and turning them into reality for these communities.
You said something earlier that I think is really important, and that's, can you go back and fix these things, or how do you go back and fix these things? And that point really emphasizes the need for planning, because you you always can't go back and fix these things. The example I love is a State Street in Orem. Sorry to my friends and neighbors in Orem for making this up, but some people have called Orem State Street the ugliest street in Utah. And that was because there was no planning on how closely those buildings were put together, what angle they faced, the signage, the setbacks and things like that. And so Orem now has been stuck for decades with this street that just looks terrible. You just can't go back and fix those things quickly. And so that's why you can tell when a city has started its conscientious planning effort when you can see differences in streets. Now, in more modern times in Orem, they've got some gorgeous streets, some really beautiful streets. The setbacks are good, the landscaping is strong, the traffic flow is calming because it's there naturally. And it's because there was a conscious effort to make that happen. On State Street, there was none of that. And so you're stuck with the process of redevelopment to fix those problems, and that takes a long time, and it's a lot more expensive.
Excellent. I'd like to shift this conversation to finding that balance of things, because obviously Orem was looking at, we want a lot of traffic through here, and they didn't think about setbacks and flows and all those other things. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll come right back to continue this conversation on the county seat. Welcome back to the county seat. We are talking about community planning and realizing that it's a much bigger picture than the geographical landscape that a community wishes to develop. So how do you go about creating a cohesive plan?
I believe that the first step in quality planning is to look at where people's property rights start and stop. So my neighbor, for example, they have a certain bundle of rights, and in rural Utah, it's a very strong sense. It's my land, I get to do what I want with it. The problem is when one landowner's rights impact the other ones. Having a sawmill next to a sleep center or something, that's not really a great idea, and one impacts the other negatively. And so when that is done, then neighbors can get together and they can start to figure out what the pattern is and what the rationale is and what the community wants to be like in the future.
And that's the key point is you get to realize, or you realize you need to ask this question: what do we want to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 30 years from now? Those questions start today, or they should start today being asked, and then that triggers the discussion, the dialogue among members of the community. Community leaders, whether they're elected or not, business leaders, neighborhood councils, those types of things, start asking that question: what do we want it to be like?
So this is kind of like the Envision Utah thing, where you have to start with a community drive to try and figure out how you get buy-in on making those compromises.
Absolutely. I think of what would it be like to be a mayor today and have a time machine. If you could go back 20, 30 years and you knew what was going to happen, maybe you'd put the water tank higher up on the hill, or you'd make the sewer pipe bigger or whatever. Communities can't really fix a lot of what's in the past. It's very expensive to do that. But if they really get invested in a comprehensive planning process, one that doesn't just look at geographic and land use issues, if they can look at the whole thing all at once, then it's like having a time machine for the future.
Does this have to be dynamic?
Absolutely.
That becomes,
Very much so.
You're planning for that water tank to be higher on the hill, and that's part of your 30-year plan, but you get 10 years into the plan. Do you have to revise your 30-year plan?
I think if there's a lot of effort put into it initially, the revisions will be minimal versus a city that realizes, we've got a huge traffic problem, and the fixes are more difficult, they're more expensive, they're a lot more impactful in the community. Moab is struggling with that right now because they want to have a certain ambiance in their community, but they've got this traffic flow through there. And that's probably because, decades ago, there wasn't much thought in terms of, all right, how are we going to move traffic through this community? It never hurts a city or a town, no matter their size, to ask that. All right, let's say 30 years from now, things could be this, or something could happen here. How do we deal with that?
But what if that if is the wrong if? And,
Absolutely.
And Moab had become a tech center instead of
Exactly.
a recreation thing. So what kind of tools do you guys bring to make that happen?
One of the number one things you want to see in a quality plan is where their assumptions are. It's not a snapshot of where you're at today. It's your assumptions of where you're going to go in the future. We love to do scenario planning where we try to envision what is the world going to look like if the local economy or whatever thrives? What has to change now to make the world thrive, or just what has to change to make it dive? And what makes it just survive, just stay the course. And so your plan, it should be a living document. It should be one that is clear on its assumptions and its goals, have a very clear line of sight onto a vision. And then when you come back 5 years later, 10 years later, or whenever you get to it, then it's easy to update because you can see we were right about this one, we were wrong about that one, therefore let's make an easy course correction.
I love I think it was General Eisenhower that said this: plans are nothing, but planning is everything. Nothing goes according to plan, but because you've started with something and have something to begin with, Mike is correct. You can make tweaks a lot easier in that plan because there's something there to work with.
It has to be a living document, no question. It's the comparison I use is, an engineering drawing set for a particular project is set in stone because that's what you need to build for that particular need. As good as the mayors are in Utah, as good as county commissioners are in Utah and beyond, they will never be able to predict clearly as they need to predict the future.
So what I'm hearing here is that for a community to really be able to plan correctly for the future, they don't just need to hire somebody to get something done. They really need to develop a relationship that's ongoing, because I would imagine it would be as disruptive for, and I'm going to probably pick the wrong engineering firm to say this, but so it could be as disruptive for a town to start working with Jones and DeMille, build something, and then switch to Sunrise 5 years when their entire thought process is different. Does the community, does that relationship become important? I'm going to throw that one to you, Mal.
No, absolutely.
You're on the receiving end.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why selecting somebody or a firm to help you through that process is so important, because it allows a community to have some continuity in thought when they've got some really solid people behind the thinking. A well-drafted plan, a document, will become self-evident in its value. It will stand the test of time, to use that cliche. 5 years from now, you'll be able to say, we hit that right. We got that right on. And that's why swiping a chapter from another community's document is such a big mistake, is because, again, you can't just go back and fix those things. You've got to go through the process, pay the price, build that relationship, not only with the firm, but with the people in your community, the residents, and say, all right, this is what we want it to be.
Okay, we're going to take a break. There are a lot of good ideas that have been floated out here, a lot of stuff for people to think about. How do you pay for it? That's where we'll take up the county seat when we come back. Welcome back to the county seat. We are talking about developing a good community plan. And I don't want to sound like a philosopher here, but what comes first? Do you come up with a plan and say we're going to fund it, or do you say this is the kind of money we pull together, let's build a plan? How do you do that?
It really becomes a matter of priority. A community, elected officials, for example, decide, we need to get this done. We need to fix what we have now. It's not working. And we go find the funding to make it happen. We pulled together some funds from a couple of different places and made it happen. Then we got the plan, and we're just about to wrap up with that. And that plan then becomes a source of our direction on where to get funding to implement the plan. And so the funding is the bread on both sides of that, and the plan, it's the steak between the slices of bread. So funding becomes both sides of the plan. You decide you're going to get funding, you go get your plan, and then the plan helps you to find funding for your implementation.
So Brian, I want to ask you a question. Planning is becoming more sophisticated. Are you noticing that the communities and the counties in the state are becoming more sophisticated too as time goes on?
Definitely. With the advent of social media and just the connected nature of everybody now, information flows just freely. Word gets out about decisions made by city councils and county commissions. There's a lot of conversation that happens outside of meetings. And, so yes, it's a very dynamic process. And I would just add to what Malcolm said, that every important project can find funding. There's a way to find a way to make a project happen if it's important and it's a priority to those communities and the counties.
But that raises a really good question. If you're a small community, I mean, I just looked down the road at Paiute County. I mean, if they would go after a lot of grants if they had a grant person. They don't have a grant person because they've just got commissioners. So how do you guys, how does a community like that look to their relationship to actually make that happen?
It's a complicated web. It's every community has its specific needs. Every community or county has its specific level of planning need or infrastructure need. And there are so many great consultants out there. There are a lot of staff members within local governments that have been through the process, and there are so many agencies at the state level, at the federal level, who are motivated to help, and they have opportunities, funding to give to the right projects in the right ways. And so it's just making those connections, understanding the process, and talking to people who have been through that process.
We're out of time. Thank you for joining us for the County. We really have to have this conversation again. This has been most informative. Remember, local government and its future and what it looks like depends upon your participation. Be involved, be part of the process. We will look for you next week on the County Seat. Thank you for watching The County Seat. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications to keep up to date on the program and happenings around Utah.